Hi, Tia. Looks like that's over. Nope. Maybe. Okay, my sound alerts work. Really? More ads? That sucks. Da-da. Da-da-da-da. Da-da. Hey Tia, thanks for subscribing. Get stuff done. Yes, there is a sub goal. And it's really just to see if I can actually make it. Can you just what? My computer's slow. I can't see what's going on. Oh, well. Thank you. It's doing all my auto shoutouts at the same time. Thank you for all the subs. Wow. And a raid. Hey, Yeti. Hey, Pixel Doctor. How you doing? Oh. And my chat is so delayed. Can't type anything. See if the shoutout command will actually work. There we go. Yes. So, how is everyone doing this evening? Go ahead and switch over to the study just to get things. Oh, why am I never seeing right when I come in here? I'm supposed to be there. There you go. Man, I'm getting all the delayed sound effects and everything. That's crazy. I'm doing good. Just trying to get things back to normal after the holidays. Well, holiday. Is that my book covering it? Move over, book. Why are you not moving? Because you're not on the right one. Move over, book. Okay, no, it's not blocking chat. But this is a book that I'm getting into. I had read most of them in order, and then a month or so ago I did a vote to see if I should read Casebook or Return first. Casebook is actually the last book for Arthur Conan Doyle. So we're going to read the Return now. But I'm going to put them all in order in the YouTube playlist. So. But at least I know the sound effects are working. Check to make sure everything else is working properly. Okay. Fireplace is going. Mic is working. Tia is indeed the first. And now she claims title. And I'm having trouble keeping all my stuff going here. Why do I have so many things open? Too many windows open. Yes, we are going to be reading... Oh, I'm going to be reading. The Return of Sherlock Holmes. This one is what actually was printed first after Holmes's canon death. Supposedly canon death. Hey, guilty! So this is the most people have had in an opening. See, even the chat in the window is delayed compared to everything else. Either that or it's just my stream that's just that slow. Alright, guilty. Hope you have a good evening at work. And guilty claims seconds. Because. Okay. Now it's crazy to believe that these stories were published 120 years ago. Because the first story in this book was published in the Strand magazine in October of 1903. But since we're here to read, and it is the night for Sherlock Holmes, until this book's over, then I guess I gotta find something else to read. The first story for the night is The Adventure of the Empty House. It was in the spring of the year 1894 that all London was interested, and the fashionable world dismayed, by the murder of the Honourable Ronald Adair under most unusual and inexplicable circumstances. The public has already learned those particulars of the crime which came out in the police investigation, but a good deal was suppressed upon that occasion, since the case for the prosecution was so overwhelmingly strong that it was not necessary to bring forward all of the facts. Only now, at the end of nearly 10 years, I am allowed to supply those missing links which make up the whole of that remarkable chain. The crime was an interest in itself, but that interest was as nothing to me compared to the inconceivable sequel, which afforded me the greatest shock and surprise of any event in my adventurous life. Even now, after this long interval, I find myself thrilling as I think of it, and feeling once more that sudden flood of joy, amazement, and incredulity which utterly submerged my mind. Let me say to the public, which has shown some interest in those glimpses which I have occasionally given them of my thoughts and actions of the very remarkable man, that they are not to blame me if I have not shared my knowledge of them, for I should have considered it my first duty to have done so had I not been barred by a positive prohibition from his own lips, which was only withdrawn upon the 3rd of last month. It can be imagined that my close intimacy with Sherlock Holmes had interested me deeply in crime, and that after his disappearance I had never failed to read with care the various problems which came before the public, and I even attempted more than once for my own private satisfaction to employ his methods in their solution, though with indifferent success. There was none, however, which appealed to me like this tragedy of Ronald Adair. As I read the evidence at the inquest which led up to the verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown, I realized more clearly than I had ever done the loss which the community had sustained by the death of Sherlock Holmes. There were points about this strange business which would, I was sure, have especially appealed to him, and the effort of the police would have been supplemented, or some probably anticipated, by the trained observation and the alert mind of the first criminal agent in Europe. All day, as I drove upon my round, I turned over the case in my mind, and found no explanation which appeared to me to be adequate. At the risk of telling a twice-told tale, I will recapitulate the facts as they were known to the public at the conclusion of the inquest. The Honourable Ronald Adair was the second son of the Earl of Maynooth, at that time governor of one of the Australian colonies. Adair's mother had returned from Australia to undergo the operation of a cataract, for she, for her son Ronald, and her daughter Hilda, were living together at 427 Park Lane. The youth moved in the best society, had, so far as known, no enemies, and no particular vices. He had been engaged to Miss Edith Woodley of Castars, but the engagement had been broken off by a mutual consent some months before, and there was no sign that it had left any very profound feeling behind it. For the rest of the man's life moved in a narrow and conventional circle, for his habits were quiet and his nature unemotional. Yet it was upon this easy-going young aristocrat that death came in the most strange and unexpected form between the hours of 10 and 11:20 on the night of March 30th, 1894. Ronald Adair was fond of cards, playing continually, but never for much stakes as would hurt him. He was a member of the Baldwin, the Cavendish, and the Bagatelle card clubs. It was shown that after dinner on the day of his death he had played in a rubber of wits at the later club. He had also played there in the afternoon. The evidence of those who had played with him, Mr. Murray, Sir John Hardy, and Colonel Moran, showed that the game was whist, and that there was a fairly equal fall of the cards. Adair might have lost £5, but not one more. His fortune was a considerable one, and such a loss could not in any way affect him. He had played nearly every day at one club or other, but he was a cautious player, and usually rose a winner. It came out in evidence that in partnership with Colonel Moran he had actually won as much as £420 in a sitting some weeks before the Godfrey Minor and Lord Ballamore. So much for his recent history as it came out in the inquest. On the evening of the crime he returned from the club exactly at 10. His mother and sister were out spending the evening with a relation. The servant disposed that she heard him enter the front room on the second floor, generally used as his sitting room. She had lit a fire, and it was smoked, and opened the window. No sound was heard from the room until 11:20, the hour of the return of Lady Mardouth and her daughter. Desiring to say good night, she attempted to enter her son's room. The door was locked on the inside, and no answer could be got from the cries and knocking. The unfortunate young man was found lying near the table. His head had been horribly mutilated by an expanding revolver bullet, but no weapon of any sort was to be found in the room. On the table lay 2 banknotes, one for £10 each, and £17, 10 in silver and gold. The money arranged in little piles of varying amount. There were some figures also upon a sheet of paper with the names of some club friends opposite to them, from which it was conjectured that before his death he was endeavoring to make out his losses or winnings at cards. A minute examination of the circumstances served only to make the case more complex. In the first place, no reason could be given why the young man should have fastened the door upon the inside. There was the possibility that the murderer had done this, and afterwards escaped by the window. The drop was at least 20 feet, however, and the bed of crocuses in full bloom lay beneath. Neither the flowers nor the earth showed any sign of having been disturbed, nor were there any marks upon the narrow strip of grass which separated the house from the road. Apparently, therefore, it was the young man himself who had fastened the door. But how did he come by his death? No one could have climbed up the window without leaving traces. Suppose a man had fired through the window. It would indeed be a remarkable shot who could with a revolver inflict so deadly a wound. Again, Park Lane is a frequented thoroughfare, and there is a cab stand within 100 yards of the house. No one had heard a shot, and yet there was the dead man, with the revolver bullet which had been mushroomed out, and soft-nosed bullets and so inflicted a wound which must have caused instantaneous death. Such were the circumstances of the Park Lane mystery, which were further complicated by entire absence of motive, since, as I have said, young Adair was not known to have any enemy, and no attempt had been made to remove the money or valuables in the room. All day I turned these facts over in my mind, endeavoring to hit upon some theory which could reconcile them all, and to find that line of least resistance which my poor friend had declared to be the starting point of every investigation. I confess that I made little progress. In the evening I strolled across the park, and found myself at 6 o'clock at the Oxford Street end of Park Lane. A group of loafers upon the pavement, all staring up at a particular window, directed me to the house which I had come to see. A tall, thin man with colored glasses, whom I strongly suspected of being a plain-clothes detective, was pointing out some theory of his own, while the others crowded around to listen to what he said. I got near him as I could, but his observations seemed to be a bit absurd, so I withdrew again in some disgust. As I did so, I struck against an elderly deformed man who had been behind me, and knocking down several books which he was carrying. I remember that I picked them up. I observed the title of one of them, The Origin of Tree Worship, and it struck me that the fellow must be some poor bibliophile who, either as a trade or as a hobby, was a collector of obscure volumes. I endeavored to apologize for the accidents, but it was evident that these books which I had so unfortunately maltreated were very precious objects in the eyes of their owner. With a snarl of contempt he turned upon his heel, and I saw his curved back and white whiskers disappear among the throng. My observations of number 427 Park Lane did little to clear up the problem which I was interested. The house was separated from the street by a low wall and railing, the whole not more than 5 feet high. It was perfectly easy, therefore, for anyone to get into the garden, but the window was entirely inaccessible, since there was no water pipe or anything which could help the most active man to climb it. More puzzled than ever, I retraced my steps to Kensington. I had not been in my study 5 minutes when the maid entered and said that the person desired to see me. My astonishment, it was none other than my strange old book collector, his sharp, wizened face peering out from the frame of white hair, and his precious volumes, a dozen of them at least, wedged under his right arm.
"Are you surprised to see me, sir?"
he said in a strange, croaking voice. I acknowledged that I was.
"Well, I'm got a conscience, sir, and when I chanced to see you go into this house, as I came hobbling after you, I thought to myself, I will just step in and see what kind of gentleman, and tell him that if I was a bit gruff in my manner, there was no harm meant, and that I am much obliged to him picking up my books."
You make too much of a trifle, said I. May I ask how you knew who I was?
"Well, sir, if it isn't too great a liberty, I am a neighbor of yours. You'll find my little bookshop at the corner of Church Street, and very happy to see you, I am sure. Maybe you collect yourself, sir. Here's British Birds, and Catullus, and the Holy War, a bargain every one of them. With 5 volumes you can just fill that gap on the second shelf. It looks untidy, does it not, sir?"
I moved my head to look at the cabinet behind me. When I turned again, Sherlock Holmes was standing smiling at me across my study table. I rose to my feet, stared at him for a few seconds in utter amazement, and then it appears that I must have fainted for the first and the last time of my life. Certainly, a grey mist swirled before my eyes, and when I cleared, I found my cauldrons done, and a tingling aftertaste of brandy upon my lips. Holmes was standing over my chair, his flask in his hand. "My dear Watson," said the well-remembered voice, "I owe you 1,000 apologies. I had no idea you would be so affected." I gripped him by the arm. "Holmes," I cried, "is it really you? Can it indeed be that you are alive? It is possible that you succeeded in climbing out of that awful abyss." "Wait a moment," said he. "Are you sure that you are really fit to discuss things? I have given you the serious shock of the unnecessarily dramatic reappearance." "I'm all right. But indeed, Holmes, I can hardly believe my eyes. Good heavens, to think that you of all men, should be standing here in my study." Again I gripped him by the sleeve and felt his thin, sinewy arm beneath it. "Well, you're not a spirit, anyhow," I said. "My dear chap, I'm overjoyed to see you. Sit down and tell me how you came out alive from that dreadful chasm." He sat opposite of me and lit a cigarette in his old, nonchalant manner. He was dressed in his seedy frock coat of the book merchant, but the rest of that individual lay in a pile of white hair and old books upon the table. Holmes looked even thinner and keener than that of old, and there was a dead white tinge to his aquiline face, which told me that his life recently had not been a healthy one. "I'm glad to stretch myself, Watson," he said. "It is no joke when a tall man has to take a foot off his stature for several hours on end. Now, my dear fellow, in the matter of these explanations we have, if I may ask you for your cooperation, hard and dangerous night's work is in front of us. Perhaps it would be better if I gave you the account of the whole situation when that work is finished." "I am full of curiosity. I should much prefer to hear now." "You'll come with me tonight?" "When you like and where you like." This is indeed like the old days. We shall have time for a mouthful of dinner before we need to go. Well then, about that chasm. I had no serious difficulty in getting out of it, for the very simple reason that I was never in it. "You never were in it?" "No, Watson, I was never in it." My note here was undoubtedly genuine. I had little doubts that I had come to the end of my career when I perceived for the somewhat sinister figure of the late Professor Moriarty standing upon the narrow pathway which led to safety. I need an inaccessible purpose in his grey eyes. I exchanged some remarks with him, therefore, and obtained his courteous permission to write a short note which you received afterwards. I left it in my cigarette box with my stick, and I walked along the pathway, Moriarty still at my heels. When I reached the end, I stood at bay. He drew no weapon, but he rushed at me and threw his long arm about me. He knew this was his own game was up, and was only anxious to revenge himself upon me. We tottered together on the brink of the fall. I have some knowledge, however, of Baritsu, or the Japanese system of wrestling, which has more than once been very useful to me. I slipped through his grasp, and he, with a horrible scream, kicked madly for a few seconds, and clawed the air with both his hands. But for all his efforts, he could not get his balance, and over he went. With my face over the brink, I saw him fall for a long way. Then he struck a rock, bounded off, and splashed into the water. I listened with amazement to this explanation which Holmes delivered between the puffs of his cigarette. "But the tracks," I cried. "I saw with my own eyes that 2 went up the path and none returned." I came about in this way. The instant that the professor had disappeared, it struck me that what a really extraordinary lucky chance fate had placed in my way. I knew that Moriarty was not the only man who had sworn my death. There were at least 3 others who desired vengeance upon me, and would only be increased by their death of their leader. They were all very dangerous men. One or the other would certainly get me. On the other hand, if all the world was convinced that I was dead, they would take their liberties. These men they would lay themselves upon, and sooner or later I could destroy them. Then it would be time for me to announce that I was still in the land of the living. So rapidly does the brain act that I believe I had thought this all out before Professor Moriarty had reached the bottom of Reichenbach Falls. I stood up and examined the rocky wall behind me. In your picturesque account of the matter, which I read with great interest some months later, you assert that the wall was sheer. That was not literally true. A few small footholds presented themselves, and there was some indication of a ledge. The cliff was so high that to climb it was all an obvious impossibility, and it was equally impossible to make my way along the wet path without leaving some tracks. I might, it was true, have reversed my foot, as I have done on similar occasions, but the sight of 3 sets of tracks in one direction would certainly have suggested a deception. On the whole, then, it was best that I should climb the rocks. It was not a pleasant business, Watson. The fall roared beneath me. I am not a fanciful person, but I give you my word that I seemed to hear Moriarty's voice screaming at me from the abyss. A mistake would have been fatal. More than once, the tufts of grass came out in my hand, or my foot slipped on the wet notches of the rock. I thought that I was gone. But I struggled upwards, and at last I reached the ledge several feet deep and covered with soft green moss, where I could lie unseen in the most perfect comfort. There I was stretched when you, my dear Watson, and all your following were investigating, in the most sympathetic and ineffectual manner, the circumstances of my death. At last, when you had all formed your inevitable and totally erroneous conclusions, I departed for the hotel, and I was left alone. I had imagined that I had reached the end of my adventures, but a very unexpected occurrence showed me that there were surprises still in store for me. A huge rock, falling from above, boomed past me, struck the path, and bounded over the chasm. For an instant I thought that it was an accident, but a moment later, looking up, I saw a man's head against the darkening sky, and another stone struck the very ledge upon which I was stretched, within a foot of my head. Of course, the meaning of this was obvious. Moriarty had not been alone. A Confederate, and even at one glance had told me how dangerous a man that Confederate was, had kept guard while the professor had attacked me. From a distance, unseen by me, he had been a witness of his friend's death and of my escape. He had waited, and then, making his way round to the top of the cliff, he had endeavored to succeed where his comrade had failed. I did not take long to think about it, Watson. Again I saw that grim face look over the cliff, and I knew that it was the persecutor of another stone. I scrambled down to the path. I don't think I could have done it in cold blood, but it was 100 times more difficult than getting up. But I had no time to think of the danger, for another stone sang past me as I hung by my hands on the edge of the ledge. Halfway down I slipped, but by the blessing of God I landed, torn and bleeding, upon the path. I took to my heels and did 10 miles over the mountains in the darkness. And a week later I found myself in Florence, with the certainty that no one in the world knew what had become of me. I only had one confidant, my brother, Mycroft. I owe you many apologies, my dear Watson, but it was all important that it should be thought that I was dead, and it is quite certain that you would have written so convincingly an account of my unhappy end, had you not yourself thought that it was true. Several times during the last 3 years I have taken up my pen to write you, but always I have feared lest your affectionate regard for me should tempt you to some indiscretion which would betray my secret. For that reason I turned away from you this evening when you upset my books, for I was in the danger at the time, and any show of surprise or emotion upon your part might have drawn attention to my identity and led me to the most deplorable and irreparable results. As to Mycroft, I had to confide in him in order to obtain the money which I needed. The course of events in London did not run so well as I had hoped, for the trial of Moriarty gang left 2 of its most dangerous members, my own most vindictive enemies, at liberty. I travelled for 2 years in Tibet, therefore, and amused myself by visiting Lhasa and spending some days with the head lama. You may have read the remarkable explorations of a Norwegian named Sigerson, and I am sure that it never occurred to you that you were receiving news of your friend. I then passed through Persia, looked in at the Mecca, and paid a short but interesting visit to the Khalifa at Khartoum, the results of which I have communicated to the Foreign Office. Returning to France, I spent some months in research into the coal tar derivatives, which I conducted in the laboratory at Montpellier, in the south of France. Having concluded this to my satisfaction, and learning that only one of my enemies was now left in London, I was about to return when my movements were hastened by the news of this very remarkable Park Lane mystery, which not only appealed to me by its own merits, but which seemed to offer the most particular personal opportunities. I came over at once to London, called my own person at Baker Street, threw Mrs. Husband into violent hysterics, and found that Mycroft had preserved my rooms and my papers exactly as they had always been. So it was, my dear Watson, that at 2 o'clock today I found myself in my old armchair in my old room, only wishing that I could have seen my old friend Watson in the other chair which he was so often adorned. Such was a remarkable narrative to which I listened on that April evening, a narrative which would have been utterly incredible to me had it not been confirmed by the actual sight of the tall, sparse figure and the keen, eager face which I had never thought to see again. In some manner he had learned of my own sad bereavement, and had sympathy was shown in his manner rather than in his words. "Work is the best antidote for sorrow, my dear Watson," said he, "and I have a piece of work for us both tonight which, if we can bring it to a successful conclusion, will in itself justify a man's life on this planet." In vain I begged him to tell me more. "You will hear more and see enough before morning," he answered. "We have 3 years of the past to discuss. Let us suffice for the half-time past 9. When we start on the notable adventure of the empty house." It was indeed like old times. At that hour I found myself seated beside him in the hansom, my revolver in my pocket, and a thrill of adventure in my heart. Holmes was cold and stern and silent. As the gleam of the street lamps flashed upon his austere features, I saw that his brows were drawn down in thought, and his thin lips compressed. I knew not what this wild beast were about to hunt down in the dark jungle of criminal London, but I was well assured from the bearing of this master huntsman that the adventure was a most grave one, while the sardonic smile which occasionally broke through his ascetic gloom
boded little good for the object of our quest. I had imagined that we were bound for Baker Street, but Holmes stopped the cab at the corner of Cavendish Square. I observed that as he stepped out, he gave a most searching glance right and left, and at every subsequent street corner he took the utmost pains to assure that he was not followed. Our route was certainly a singular one. Holmes' knowledge of the byways of London was extraordinary, and on this occasion he passed rapidly and with an assured step through a network of mews and stables, the very existence of which I had never known. We emerged at last into a small road lined with old, gloomy houses, which led us into Manchester Street, and so to Blandford Street. Here he turned swiftly down a narrow passage, passed through a wooden gate into a deserted yard, then opened with a key the back door of a house. We entered together, and he closed it behind us. The place was pitch dark, but it was evident to me that it was an empty house. Our feet creaked and crackled over the bare planking, and my outstretched hand touched a wall from which the paper was hanging in ribbons. Holmes's cold, thin fingers closed around my wrist and led me forwards down a long hall, until I dimly saw a murky fanlight over the door. Here Holmes turned suddenly to the right, and we found ourselves in a large, square, empty room, heavily shadowed in the corners, but faintly lit in the center from the lights of the street beyond. There was no lamp near the window. It was thick with dust, so that we could not only discern each other's figures within. My companion put his hand upon my shoulder and his lips close to my ear.
"Do you know where we are?"
he whispered. "Surely that is Baker Street," I answered, staring through the dim window. "Exactly.
We're in the Camden House, which stands opposite to our own old quarters."
"But why are we here?"
"Because it commands so excellent a view of that picturesque pile. Might I trouble you, my dear Watson, to draw a little nearer to the window, taking every precaution not to show yourself, then to look up at our old room, the starting point of so many of our little adventures. We will see if my 3 years' absence has entirely taken away my power to surprise you."
I crept forward and looked across to the familiar window. As my eyes fell upon it, I gave a gasp and a cry of astonishment. The blind was down, and a strong light was burning in the room. The shadow of a man who was seated in the armchair was thrown in hard black outline upon the luminous screen of the window. There was no mistaking the poise of the head, the squareness of the shoulders, the sharpness of the features. The face was turned half round, and the effect was that of one of those black silhouettes which our grandparents loved to frame. It was a perfect reproduction of Holmes. So amazed was I that I threw out my hand to make sure that the man himself was standing beside me. He was quivering with silent laughter. "Well," said he. "Good heavens," I cried. "It's marvelous."
"I trust the age doth not wither, nor custom stale my infinite variety,"
said he, as I recognized his voice of joy, the pride of the artist takes in his own work.
"It really is rather like me, is it not?"
"I should be prepared to swear that it was you."
"The credit of the execution is due to Monsieur Oscar Monnier of Grenoble, who spent some days in doing the moulding. It is a bust in wax. The rest I arranged myself during my visit to Baker Street this afternoon."
"But why?"
"Because, my dear Watson, I had the strongest possible reason for wishing certain people to think that I was there when I really was elsewhere."
"And you thought the rooms were watched?"
"I knew they were watched."
"By whom?"
"By my old enemies, Watson. By the charming society whose leader lies at the bottom of Reichenbach Fall. You must remember that they knew, and only they knew, that I was still alive. Sooner or later they believed that I should come back to my rooms. They watched them continuously, and this morning they saw me arrive."
"How do you know?"
"Because I recognized the sentinel when I glanced out of my window. He is a harmless enough fellow, Parker by name, a garroter by trade, and a remarkable performer on the Jewish harp."
I cared nothing for him, but I cared a great deal for a much more formidable person who was behind him. The bosom friend of Moriarty, the man who dropped the rocks over the cliff, the most cunning and dangerous criminal in London. That is the man who is after me tonight, Watson, and that is the man who is quite unaware that we are after him. My friend's plans were gradually revealing themselves. From this convenient retreat, the watchers being watched, and the trackers tracked. That angular shadow up yonder was the bait, and we were the hunters. In silence we stood together in the darkness, and watched the hurrying figures who passed and repassed in front of the house. Holmes was silent and motionless, but I could tell that he was keenly alert, and that his eyes were fixed intently upon the stream of passers-by. It was a bleak and boisterous night, and the wind whistled shrilly down the long street. Many people were moving to and fro, most of them muffled in their coats and cravats. Once or twice it seemed to me that I had seen the same figure before, and I especially noticed two men who appeared to be sheltering themselves from the wind in the doorway of a house some distance up the street. I tried to draw my companion's attention to them, but he gave a little ejaculation of impatience, and continued to stare into the street. More than once he fidgeted at his feet and tapped rapidly with his fingers upon the wall. It was evident to me that he was becoming uneasy, and that his plans were not working altogether as he had hoped. At last, as midnight approached, the street gradually cleared. He paced up and down the room in uncontrolled agitation. I was about to raise some remark to him when I raised my eyes to the lighted window and again experienced almost a great moment of surprise. I clutched Holmes' arm and pointed upwards. "The shadow has moved," I cried. It was indeed no longer in profile, but the back, which was turned towards us. 3 years had certainly not smoothed the asperities of his temper or his impatience with the less active intelligence than his own. "Of course it has moved," he said. "I am such a farcical bungler, Watson, that I should erect an obvious dummy and expect some of the sharpest men in Europe to be deceived by it. We have been in this room for 2 hours. Miss Hudson has made some change in that figure 8 times, and once in every quarter of an hour. She works at it from the front so that her shadow may never be seen. Ah!" He drew in his breath with a shrill, excited intake. The dim lights I saw on his head thrown forward, and his whole attitude rigid with attention. Outside, the street was absolutely deserted. Those 2 men might still be crouching in the doorway, but I could no longer see them. All was still and dark, save only the brilliant yellow screen in front of us with the black figure outlined upon its center. Again, in the utter silence, I heard that thin, sibilant note which spoke of intense, suppressed excitement. An instant later, he pulled me back into the blackest corner of the room, and I felt his warm hand upon my lips. The fingers which clutched me were quivering, and now had I known my friend had moved, and yet the dark street still stretched lonely and motionless before us. But suddenly I was aware of that which his keener senses had already distinguished. A low, stealthy sound came to my ears, not from the direction of Baker Street, but from the back of the very house in which we lay concealed. The door opened and shut. An instant later, steps crept down the passage. Steps which were meant to be silent, but which reverberated harshly through the empty house. Holmes crouched back against the wall, and I did the same, my hand closing on the handle of my pistol. Peering through the gloom, I saw the vague outline of a man, a shade blacker than the blackness of the open door. He stood for an instant, and then he crept forward, crouching, menacing into the room. He was within 3 yards of us, the sinister figure, and I had braced myself to meet his spring, before I realized that he had no idea of our presence. He passed close beside us, stole over to the window, and very softly and noiselessly raised it for half a foot. He sank to the level of the opening. The light of the street, no longer dimmed by the dusty glass, fell full upon his face. The man seemed to be beside himself with excitement. His 2 eyes shone like stars, and his features were working convulsively. He was an elderly man, with a thin, projecting nose, a high, bald forehead, and huge, grizzled mustache.
opera bat was pushed to the back of his head, and he was evening dress, shirt front gleamed out through his open overcoat. His face was gaunt and swarthy, scored with deep, savage lines. In his hand he carried what appeared to be a stick, but that he laid it down on the floor it gave a metallic clang. Then from his pocket of his overcoat he drew a bulky object, and he busied himself with some task which ended with a loud, sharp click, as if a spring or a bolt had fallen into place. Still kneeling upon the floor, he bent forward, and still threw all his weight and strength upon some lever, with the same result that came a long, whirling, grinding noise, ending once more in a powerful click. He straightened himself then, and I saw that he had held in his hand some sort of gun with a curiously misshapen butt. He opened it at the breech and put something in, and then he snapped the breech block. Then, crouching down, he rested the end of the barrel upon the ledge of the open window, and I saw his long mustache droop over the stock, and his eye gleam as it peered along the sights. I heard a little sigh of satisfaction as he cuddled the butt again to his shoulder, and I saw the amazing target, the black man on the yellow ground, standing clear at the end of his foresight. In an instant he was rigid and motionless. Then his finger tightened on the trigger. There was a strange, loud whiz and a long, silvery tinkle of broken glass. At that instant, Holmes sprang like a tiger on the marksman's back and hurled him flat down on his face. He was up again at the moment, and in convulsive strength he had seized Holmes by the throat, but I struck him on the head with the butt of my revolver, and he dropped again to the floor. I fell upon him, and as I held him, my comrade threw a shrill call and whistle. There was a clatter of running feet upon the pavement, and two policemen in uniform, one with plain-clothes detective, rushed through the front entrance and into the room. "That you, Lestrade?" said Holmes. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I took the job myself. It's good to see you back in London, sir." "I think you want a little unofficial help. These undetected murders in 1 year won't do, Lestrade. But you handled the Mosley mystery with less than usual, so that's to say you handled it fairly well." We had risen to our feet, our prisoner breathing hard, with a stalwart constable on either side of him. Already a few loiterers had begun to collect on the street. Holmes stepped up to the window, closed it, and dropped the blinds. Lestrade had produced 2 candles, and the policemen had uncovered their lanterns. I was able at last to have a good look at our prisoner. It was a tremendously virile and yet sinister face which was turned towards us, with the brow of a philosopher above the jaw of a sensualist below. The man must have started with great capacities for good or for evil. But one could not look upon his cruel blue eyes and their drooping, cynical lids, or upon the fierce, aggressive nose and the threatening, deep-lined brow without reading nature's plainest danger signals. He took no heed of any of us, but his eyes were fixed upon Holmes's face with an expression in which hatred and amazement were equally blended. "You fiend!" he kept on muttering. "You clever, clever fiend!" "Ah, Colonel," said Holmes, arranging his rumpled collar. "Journeys end in lovers' meetings, as the old play says. I don't think I have the pleasure of seeing you since you favored me with those attentions as I lay on the ledge above Reichenbach Fall." The colonel stared at my friend like a man in a trance. "You cunning, cunning fiend," was all that he could say. "I have not introduced you yet," said Holmes. "This gentleman is Colonel Sebastian Morin, one of Her Majesty's Indian Army, and the best heavy game shot in our Eastern Empire has ever produced. I believe I am correct, Colonel, in saying that your bag of tigers still remains unrivaled?" The fierce man said nothing, but still glared at my companion. With his savage eyes and bristly mustache, he was wonderfully like a tiger himself. "I wonder that my very simple stratagem could deceive an old shikaree," said Holmes. "It must be very familiar to you. Have you not tethered a young kid under a tree, lain above it as a trifle, and waited for the baits to bring up your tiger? This empty house is my tree. and you are my tiger. You have possibly been other guns in reserve in case these should have several tigers, or in the unlikely supposition of your own aim failing you. These, he pointed around, are my other guns. The parallel is exact.
Colonel Morin sprang forward with a snarl of rage, but the constables dragged him back. The fury upon his face was terrible to look at.
I confess that you had one small surprise for me, said Holmes. I did not anticipate that you yourself would make use of an empty house and this convenient front window. I'd imagined you was operating from the street, where your friend Lestrade and his merry men were awaiting you. With the exception, all has gone as I expected.
Colonel Morin turned to the official detective.
You may or may not have just the cause for arresting me, said he, but at least there can be no reason that I should submit to the gibes of this person. If I'm to lay hands of the law, let things be done in the legal way.
Oh, that's reasonable enough, said Lestrade. Nothing further you have to say, Mr. Holmes, before we go? Holmes had picked up a powerful air gun from the floor and was examining its mechanism.
An admirable and unique weapon, said Holmes. Noiseless and of tremendous power. I knew von Heffer, the blind German mechanic who constructed it on the order of late Moriarty. For years I have been aware of its existence, though I have never before had the opportunity of handling it. I commend it very specially to your attention, Lestrade, and also the bullets which fit it.
You can trust us to look after that, Mr. Holmes, said Lestrade, as the whole party moved towards the door.
Anything further to say?
I wanted to ask what charge you intend to prefer.
What charge, sir? Why, of course, the attempted murder of Mrs. Sherlock Holmes. Not so, Lestrade. I do not propose to appear in the matter at all. To you, and to you only, belongs the credit of this remarkable arrest which you have effected. Yes, Lestrade, I congratulate you. With your usual happy mixture of cunning and audacity, you have got him.
Got him? Got who, Mr. Holmes?
The man that the whole force has been seeking in vain, Colonel Sebastian Morin, who shot the Honorable Ronald Adair with an expanding bullet from an air gun through an open window of the second floor front of number 427 Park Lane upon the 30th of last month. That's the charge, Lestrade. And now, Watson, if you can endure the draught of a broken window, I think that an hour in my study over a cigar may afford some profitable amusement.
Our old chambers had been left unchanged through the supervision of Mycroft Holmes and the immediate care of Mrs. Hudson. As I entered, I saw, it was true, an unwonted tidiness, but the old landmarks were all in their place. There were the chemical corner and the acid-stained, deal-topped table. There upon the shelf was a row of formidable scrapbooks and books of reference which many of our fellow citizens would have been so glad to burn. The diagrams, the violin case, and the pipe rack, even the Persian slipper which contained the tobacco, all met my eyes as I glanced around me. There were two occupants of the room. One, Mrs. Hudson, who beamed upon us both as we entered, and the other a strange dummy which had played so important a part of the evening's adventures. It was a wax-colored model of my friend, so admirably done that it was a perfect facsimile. It stood on a small pedestal of an old dressing-gown of Holmes, so draped round it so that the illusion of the street was absolutely perfect.
I hope you preserved all precautions, Mrs. Hudson, said Holmes.
I went to it on my knees, sir, just as you told me.
Excellent. You carried the thing out very well. Did you observe where the bullet went?
Yes, sir. I'm afraid it has spoiled your evening, your beautiful bust, for it passed right through the head and flattened itself on the wall. I picked it up from the cabinet. Here it is.
Holmes held it out to me. A soft revolver bullet, as you perceive, Watson. There's a genius in that, for who would expect to find such a thing fired from an air gun? All right, Mrs. Watson, I'm much obliged for your assistance. And now, Watson, Let me see you in your old seat once more, for there are several points which I should like to discuss with you. He had thrown off the seedy frock coat and he was as Holmes of old in the mouse-colored dressing gown which he took from his effigy. Old Shikari's nerves have got long their steadiness, nor his eyes their keenness, he said with a laugh, as he inspected the shattered forehead of his bust. Plumb in the middle of the back of the head and smack through the brain. He was the best shot in India, and I expect that there are few better in London. Have you heard the name? No, I have not. Well, such is fame. But then, if I remember right, you had not heard the name of Professor James Moriarty, who had one of the greatest brains in the century. Just give me down my index of biographies from the shelf. He turned over the pages lazily, leaning in the back of his chair and blowing great clouds from his cigar. My collection of M's is a fine one, he said. Moriarty himself is enough to make any letter illustrious, and here's Morgan, the prisoner, and Merridew, of the abominable memory, and Matthews, who knocked out my left canine in the waiting room of Charing Cross, and finally, here's our friend tonight. He handed over the book, and I read, Moran, Sebastian, Colonel, unemployed, formerly 1st Bangalore Pioneers, born London, 1840, son of Sir Augustus Moran, C.B., once British Minister to Persia. Education, Eton and Oxford. Served in Jawaki campaign, Afghan campaign, Charasab dispatches, Shirpur and Kabul. Author of Heavy Game of the Western Himalayas, 1881. 3 Months in the Jungle, 1884. Address, Conduit Street. Clubs, the Anglo-Indian, the Tankerville, and the Bagatelle Card Club. On the margin was written, in Holmes' precise hand, the 2nd most dangerous man in London. This is astonishing, said I, as I handed back the volume. The man's career is that of an honorable soldier. It is true, Holmes exclaimed. Up to a certain point he did well. He was always there with a man of iron nerve, and the story is still told in India that he crawled down a drain after a wounded man eating tiger. There are some trees, Watson, which grow to a certain height and then suddenly develop with the most unsightly eccentricity. You see that often in humans. I have a theory that the individual represents in his development the whole procession of his ancestors, and that such a sudden turn to good or evil stands for the long influence that came into the line of his pedigree. The person becomes, as it were, the epitome of the history of his own family. It surely is rather fanciful. Well, I don't insist upon it, whatever the cause. Colonel Moran began to go wrong. Without any open scandal, he still made India too hot to hold him. He retired, came to London, and again acquired an evil name. It was at this time that he was sought out by Professor Moriarty, to whom for a time he was the chief of staff. Moriarty supplied him liberally with money and used him only in 1 or 2 very high-class jobs, which no extraordinary criminal could have undertaken. You may have some recollection of the death of Mrs. Stewart of Lauder in 1887? No? Well, I am sure Moran was at the bottom of it, but nothing could be proved. So cleverly was the colonel concealment that even when Moriarty gang was broken up, he could not incriminate him. You remember that date, when I called upon you in your rooms, and how I put up the shutters in fear of air guns? No doubt you thought me fanciful. I knew exactly what I was doing it for. I knew the existence of this remarkable gun, and knew also that one of the best shots in the world would be behind it. When we were in Switzerland, he followed us with Moriarty. It was undoubtedly he who gave me the evil 5 minutes of Reichenbach ledge. You may remember that I read the papers with some attention in my sojourn in France, on the lookout for any chance of him lying in the heels. So long was he free of London that my life would really not have been worth living. Night and day the shadow would have been over me, and sooner or later his chance must have come. What could I do? I could not shoot him at sight, or I should myself be in the dock. There was no use appealing to the magistrate. They could not interfere with the strength of what would appear to be a wild suspicion. So I could do nothing. But I watched the criminal news. Knowing that sooner or later I should get him. Then came the death of Ronald Adair. My chance had come at last. Knowing what I did, it was certain that Colonel Moran had done it. Had he played the cards with the lad, he had followed him home from the club, he had shot him through the open window. There was no doubt of it. The bullets alone are enough to put his head in the noose. I came over at once, and I had seen by the sentinel who would, I knew, discreet the colonel's attention for my presence. He could not fail to connect the sudden return with his crime, and to be terribly alarmed. I was sure that he would make an attempt to get me out of the way at once, and would bring round his murderous weapon for that purpose. I left him an excellent mark on the window, and, having warned the police that they might be needed— by the way, Watson, you spotted the presence in the doorway of the unerring accuracy— I took up what seemed to be a judicious post, what seemed to me to be for observation, never dreaming that he would choose the same spot for his attack. Now, my dear Watson, does anything remain for me to explain?
Yes, said I. You have not made it clear what was Colonel Moran's motive for murdering the Honourable Ronald Adair.
Ah, my dear Watson, there we come into those realms of conjecture where the most logical mind may be at fault. Each may form his own hypothesis upon the present evidence, and yours is likely to be as correct as mine.
You have formed one, then?
I think that it is not difficult to explain the facts. It came out that the evidence that Colonel Moran and young Adair had between them won a considerable amount of money. Now, Moran undoubtedly played foul, for that I have been long aware. I believe that on the day of the murder, Adair had discovered that Moran was cheating. Very likely had spoken to him privately, and had threatened to expose him unless he voluntarily resigned his membership of the club, and promised not to play cards again. It is unlikely that a youngster like Adair would at once make a hideous scandal by exposing a well-known man such as older than himself. Probably he acted as I suggest. The conclusion from his clubs would mean ruin for Moran, who lived by his ill-gotten card games. He therefore murdered Adair, who at the time was endeavoring to work out how much money he should himself return, since he could not profit by his partner's foul play. He locked the door, lest the lady should surprise him and insist upon knowing what he was doing with these names and coins. Will it pass?
I have no doubt that you have hit upon the truth.
It will be verified or disproved at the trial. Meanwhile, come what may, Colonel Moran will trouble us no more. The famous airgun of von Herder will embellish the Scotland Yard Museum, and once again, Mr. Sherlock Holmes is free to devote his life to examining those interesting little problems which complex life of London so plentifully presents. Ooh. And good timing too, because we just made it into the ads, I guess. Oops. Ouch. Why are you not closing, book? Hello, cat. Oh. So that is how Holmes makes his reappearance in London, after being dead for 3 years. Thank you everyone who stuck through all that. I apologize for stumbling a lot. And thank you, Tia, for all the gift subs, because that is just freaking awesome. So that's still going. Oh, they're not. Let me check. Nope, the ads are over. Cool. No, I don't know. One of the gift subs hit my backup account, so I can't check the ads. Ouch. Okay, it's take a stretch break so I can get into the next one. So I'll be back in a bit. Okay, I'm back, sorta, mostly. So that is technically the story of Holmes showing back up alive. Kind of cool, huh? I need to fix the cover on this book. I'll do that later. I got some clear tapes for it. Let's see, how long is this next one? Okay, this one is just as long. Okay. So, next story for the evening. I just like Watson's voice. Have none of my timed things have been posting, have they? The only timed post going right now is coffee and Pokemon. Stream elements. What is your problem? I really wonder sometimes. You set up all these timers and stuff to go off and nothing happens. I mean, they're all turned on. Okay, let's just keep reading. I mean, I'd rather read than worry about ads anyway. The second story for the evening is The Adventure of the Norwood Builder. From the point of view of the criminal expert, said Mr. Sherlock Holmes, London has become a singularly uninteresting city since the death of the late lamented Professor Moriarty. I can hardly think that you would find many decent citizens to agree with you, I answered. Well, I must not be selfish, said he with a smile as he pushed back his chair from the breakfast table. The community is certainly the gainer, and not one the loser. Save for a poor out-of-work specialist, whose occupation is gone. With a man in the field, one's morning paper presented infinite possibilities. Often it was his smallest trace, Watson, the faintest indication. And yet it was enough to tell me that the great malignant brain was there, and the greatest tremors from the edges of the web reminded one of the foul spider which lurks in the center. Petty theft, wanton assault, purposeless outrage. The man who held the clue on all the world, one connected whole. To the scientific students of the higher criminal world, no capital in Europe offered the advantages which London then possessed. But now, He shrugged his shoulders in humorous deprecation of the state of things, which he had himself done so much to produce. At the time of which I speak, Holmes had been back for some months, and I, at his request, had sold my practice to return to share the old quarters at Baker Street. A young doctor named Werner had purchased my small Kensington practice, and given with astonishingly little demur the highest price that I ventured to ask, an incident which he only explained himself some years later when I found that Werner was a distant relation of Holmes's, and that it was my friend who had really found the money. Our months of partnership had not been uneventful, as he had stated, for I find on looking over my notes that this period includes the case of the papers of the ex-president Murillo, and also the shocking affair of the Dutch steamship Friesland, which so nearly cost us both of our lives. His cold and proud nature was always averse, however, to anything in the shape of public applause, and he bound me in the most stringent terms to say no further word of himself, his methods, or his success, a prohibition which, as I have explained, has only now been removed. Mr. Sherlock Holmes was leaning back in his chair after his whimsical protest, and was unfolding his morning paper in a leisurely fashion, when our attention was arrested by the tremendous ring at the bell, followed immediately by a hollow drumming sound, as if someone was beating at the outer door with his fist. As it opened, there came a tumultuous rush into the hall, rapid feet clattering up the stair, and an instant later, a wild-eyed and frantic young man, pale, disheveled, and palpitating, burst into the room. He looked from one to the other of us, and under our gaze of inquiry he became conscious that some apology was needed for his unceremonious entry. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes," he cried. "You mustn't blame me. I'm nearly mad. Mr. Holmes, I'm the unhappy John Hector MacFarlane." He made the announcement as if his name alone would explain both his visits and his manner. But I could only see by my companion's unresponsive face that it meant no more to him than to me. "Have a cigarette, Mr. MacFarlane," said he, pushing his case across. "I'm sure that with your symptoms my friend Dr. Watson would prescribe a sedative. The weather has been so very warm these last few days. Now, if you feel a little more composed, I should be glad if you would sit down in that chair and tell us, very slowly and quietly, who you are and what it is you want. You mentioned your name, as if I should recognize it, but I assure you that, beyond the obvious facts that you are a bachelor, a solicitor, and a Freemason, and an asthmatic, I know nothing whatsoever about you." Familiar as I was with my friend's methods, it was not difficult for me to follow his deductions, and to observe the untidiness of his attire, the sheaf of legal papers, the watch charm, and the breathing which had prohibited him. Our client, however, stared in amazement. "Yes, I'm all that, Mr. Holmes, and in addition, I'm the most unfortunate man at the moment in London. For heaven's sake, don't abandon me, Mr. Holmes. If they come to arrest me before I've finished my story, make them give me the time so that I can tell you the whole truth. I could go home to the gaol happy if I knew that you were working for me outside." "Arrest you?" said Holmes. "This is really most interesting. On what charge do you expect to be arrested for?" "Oh, upon the charge of murdering Mr. Jonas Aldacre of Lower Norwood." My companion's expressive face showed a sympathy which was not, I'm afraid, entirely unmixed with satisfaction. "Dear me," he said. "It was only this moment at breakfast that I was saying no to my friend, Dr. Watson. The sensational cases had disappeared out of our papers." A visitor stretched forward a quivering hand and picked up the Daily Telegraph, which still lay upon Holmes's knee. "If you'd looked at it, sir, you'd have seen at a glance what the errand is on which I have come to you this morning.
I feel as if my name and my misfortune must be in every man's mouth.
It turned it over to expose the central page.
Here it is, and with your permission, I'll read it to you. Listen to this, Mr. Holmes. The headlines are, Mysterious Affair at Lower Norwood. Disappearance of a well-known builder. Suspicion of murder and arson. A clue to the criminal. That is a clue which they are already following, Mr. Holmes. And I know that leads infallibly to me. I've been followed from London Bridge Station, and I'm sure that they are only waiting for me with a warrant to arrest me. It will break my mother's heart. It will break her heart.
He wrung his hands in an agony of apprehension and swayed backwards and forwards in his chair. I looked at interest upon this man who was accused of being the perpetrator of a crime of violence. He was flaxen-haired and handsome in a washed-out, negative fashion, with frightened blue eyes and a clean-shaven face, with a weak, sensitive mouth. His age may have been about 27. His dress and bearing were that of a gentleman. From the pocket of his light summer overcoat produced the bundle of endorsed papers with he proclaimed his profession.
"We must use what time we have," said Holmes. "Watson, would you have the kindness to take the paper out and read me the paragraph in question?"
Underneath the vigorous headlines which our client had quoted, I read the following suggestive narrative. Late last night and early morning, an incident occurred at Lower Norwood which points, it is feared, at a serious crime. Mr. Jonas Oldacre is a well-known resident of that suburb, where he has carried his old business as a builder for many years. Mr. Oldacre is a bachelor, 52 years of age, and lives in Deep Den House, at the Sydenham end of the road of that name. He has the reputation of being a man of eccentric habits, secretive and retiring. For some years he has practically withdrawn from his business, to which he is said to have amassed considerable wealth. A small timber yard still exists, however, at the back of his house, and last night, about 12 o'clock, an alarm was given that one of the stacks was on fire. The engines were soon upon the spot, but the dry wood burned with a great fury, and it was impossible to arrest the conflagration until the stack had been entirely consumed. Up to this point, the incident before the appearance of an ordinary accident, but fresh indications seemed to point to a serious crime. Surprise was expressed at the absence of the master of the establishment from the scene of the fire, and an inquiry followed which showed that he had disappeared from the house. An examination of his room revealed that the bed had not been slept in, that a safe which stood in it was open, that a number of important papers were scattered about the room, and finally, that there were signs of a murderous struggle. Slight traces of blood being found within the room, and an oaken walking stick, which also showed stains of blood upon the handle. It is shown that Mr. Jonas Oldacre had received a late visitor in his bedroom upon that night. The stick found has been identified as the property of this person, who was a young London solicitor named John Hector McFarlane, junior partner at Graham and McFarlane, 426 Gresham Buildings, E.C. The police believe that they have evidence in their possession which supplies a very convincing motive for the crime, and altogether it cannot be doubted that the sensational developments will follow. Later, it is rumored that we go to press that Mr. John Hector McFarlane has actually been arrested on the charge of murder of Mr. Jonas Oldacre. It is at least that a warrant has been issued. There have been further and sinister developments in the investigation in Norwood. Besides the signs of a struggle in the room of the unfortunate builder, it is now known that the French windows of his bedroom, which is on the ground floor, were found to be open, that there were marks of some bulky object had been dragged through the woodpile, and finally it is asserted that the charred remains have been found among the charcoal ashes of the fire. The police theory is that the most sensational crime has been committed, that the victim was clubbed to death in his own room, his papers rifled, and his dead body dragged across the wood stack, which was then ignited as to hide all traces of the crime.
The conduct of the criminal investigation has been left in the experienced hands of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who is following up the clues with his accustomed energy and sagacity. Sherlock Holmes listened with closed eyes and fingertips together to his remarkable account. "The case has certainly some points of interest," said he in his languid fashion. "May I ask, in the first place, Mr. MacFarlane, how is it that you are still at liberty, since the papers appears to be enough evidence to justify your arrest?"
"I live at Torrington Lodge, Blackheath, with my parents, Mr. Holmes. But last night, having to do business very late with Mr. Jonas Oldacre, I stayed at a hotel in Norwood, and came to my business from there. I knew nothing of this affair until I was on the train when I read what you have just read. I at once saw the horrible danger of my position, and hurried to put the case into your hands. I have no doubt that I should have been arrested, either at my city office or at home. A man followed me from London Bridge Station, I have no doubt. Great heavens, what is that?"
There was a loud clang of the bell, followed instantly by heavy steps upon the stair. A moment later, our old friend Lestrade appeared in the doorway. Over his shoulder, I caught a glimpse of one of two ununiformed police outside.
"Mr. John Hector MacFarlane?"
said Lestrade. Our unfortunate client rose with a ghastly face.
"I arrest you for the wilful murder of Mr. Jonas Oldacre of Lower Norwood."
MacFarlane turned to us with a gesture of despair and sank into his chair once more, like one who is crushed. "One moment, Lestrade," said Holmes. "Half an hour more or less can make no difference to you, and the gentleman was about to give us an account of this very interesting affair, which might aid us to clearing it up."
"I think there will be no difficulty in clearing it up," said Lestrade grimly.
"Nonetheless, with your permission, I should much be interested to hear his account."
"Well, Mr. Holmes, it is difficult for me to refuse you anything, for you have been used to the force once or twice in the past, and we owe you a good turn at Scotland Yard," said Lestrade. "At the same time, I must remain with my prisoner, and I am bound to warn him that anything he say may and will be used in evidence against him."
"I wish you nothing better," said our client. "All I ask you is you should hear and recognize the absolute truth." Lestrade looked at his watch. "I'll give you half an hour," said he. "I must explain first," said MacFarlane, "that I knew nothing of Mr. Jonas Oldacre. His name was familiar to me, for many years ago my parents were acquainted with him, but they drifted apart. I was very much surprised, therefore, when yesterday, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he walked into my office in the city. But I was still more astonished when he told me the object of his visit. He had in his hand several sheets of notebook, covered in scribbling writing. Here they are, and he laid them upon my table. "Here is my will," he said. "I want you, MacFarlane, to cast it into the proper legal shape. I will sit here while you do so." I set myself to copy it, and you can imagine my astonishment when I found that, with some reservations, he had left all of his property to me. He was a little strange ferret-like man, with white eyelashes, and when I looked up at him I found his keen grey eyes fixed upon me with an amused expression. I could hardly believe my own senses when I read the terms of the will, but he explained that he was a bachelor with hardly any living relations, and that he had known my parents in his youth, and that he had always heard me a very deserving young man, and assured me that his money would be in worthy hands. Of course, I could only stammer out my thanks, and this will duly finished, signed, and witnessed by my clerk. This is on the blue paper, and these slips, as I have explained, are a rough draft. Mr. Jonas Oldacre then informed me that there was a number of documents, building leases, title deeds, mortgages, script, and so forth, which is necessary that I should see to understand. He said that his mind would not be easy until the whole thing was settled, and he begged me to come out to his house at Norwood that night, bring the will with me, and to arrange all the matters.
Remember, my boy, not a word to your parents about the affair until everything is settled. We will keep it a little surprise for them. He was very insistent upon it at this point, and made me promise it faithfully. You can imagine, Mr. Holmes, that I was not in the humor to refuse him anything that he might ask. He was my benefactor, and all my desire was to carry out his wishes in that very particular order. I sent a telegram home, therefore, to say that I had important business on hand, and that it was impossible for me to say how late I might be. Mr. Oldacre had told me that he would like me to have supper with him at 9, as he might not be home before that hour. I had some difficulty in finding his house, however, and it was nearly half past before I reached it. I found him. "One moment," said Holmes. "Who opened the door?" "A middle-aged woman who was, I suppose, his housekeeper?" "And it was she, I presume, who mentioned your name?" "Exactly," said MacFarlane. "Pray proceed." MacFarlane wiped his damp brow, and then continued his narrative. "I was shown by this woman into a sitting room where a frugal supper was laid out. Afterwards, Mr. Jonas Oldacre led me into his bedroom, in which there stood the heavy safe. He opened and took out a mass of documents, which we went over together. It was between 11 and 12 when he finished. I remarked that we must not disturb the housekeeper. He showed me out through his own French window, which had been open all the time." "Was the blind down?" asked Holmes. "I will not be sure. I believe that it was only half down." "Yes, I remember how he pulled it up in order to swing open the window. I could not find my stick, and he said, 'Never mind, my boy, I shall see a good deal of you tomorrow. I hope, and I will keep your stick until you come back to claim it.' I left him there, the safe open, and the papers made up in packets on the table. It was so late that I could not get back to Blackheath, so I spent the night at the Annerley Arms. I knew nothing more until I read of this horrible affair in the morning." "Anything more you would like to ask, Mr. Holmes?" said Lestrade, whose eyebrows had gone up once or twice during the remarkable explanation. "Not until I have been to Blackheath." "You mean to Norwood?" said Lestrade. "Oh, yes, no doubt, that is what I must have meant," said Holmes with his enigmatic smile. Lestrade had learned by more experiences than he could care to acknowledge that the resolute brain could cut through that which was impenetrable to him. "I think I should like to have a word with you in private, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Now, Mr. MacFarlane, 2 of my constables are at the door, and there is a 4-wheeler waiting." The wretched young man arose, and with his last beseeching glance at us, he walked out from the room. The officers conducted him to the cab, but Lestrade remained. Holmes had picked up the pages which formed a rough draft of the will, and was looking at them with the keenest interest upon his face. "There are some points about this document, Lestrade, are there not?" he said, pushing them over. The official looked at them with a puzzled expression. "I can read the first few lines, and these are in the middle of the second page, and at 1 or 2 at the end. Those are as clear as the print," said he, "but the writing between is very bad, and there are all 3 places where I cannot read at all." "What do you make of that?" said Holmes. "Well, what do you make of it?" "That it was written in a train. Good writing represents stations, the bad writing represents movement, and the very bad writing, passing over points. A scientific expert would pronounce at once that this line was drawn up in a suburban line, since nowhere save in the immediate vicinity of a great city would there be so quick a succession of points. Granting that this whole journey was occupied by drawing up the will, then the train was an express, only stopping once between Norwood and London Bridge." Lestrade began to laugh. "You are too many for me when you begin to get on your theories, Mr. Holmes," said he. "How does this bear on the case?" "Well, it corroborates the young man's story to the extent that the will was drawn up by Jonas Oldacre in his journey yesterday.
It is curious, is it not, that a man should draw up so important a document in a haphazard fashion. I suggest that he do not think it was going to be much of a practical importance. If a man drew up a will which he did not intend over to be effective, he might do so.
Well, he drew up his own death warrant at the same time, said Lestrade.
Oh, you think so? Don't you? Well, it was quite impossible, but the case is not clear to me yet. Not clear? Well, if it isn't clear, what could be clear? Here's a young man who learns suddenly that if a certain older man dies, he will succeed in a fortune. What does he do? He says nothing to anyone, but he arranges that he shall go out on some pretext to see his client that night. He waits until the only other person in the house is in bed, and then in the solitude of the man's room he murders him, burns his body in the woodpile, and departs to a neighboring hotel. Bloodstains in the room and also on the stick are very slight, so it's probable that he imagined this crime to be bloodless, and hoped that if the body were consumed it would hide all traces as the method of his death. Traces which for some reason must be pointed to him. Is this not all obvious? It strikes me, my good Lestrade, as being just a trifle too obvious, said Holmes. You do not add imagination to your other great qualities. But if you could, for your moment, put yourself in the place of this young man, would you choose the very night after the will had been made to commit your crime? Would it not seem dangerous to you to make so close a relation between the two incidents? Again, would you choose an occasion when you are known to be in the house, when a servant has let you in? And finally, would you take the great pains to conceal the body and yet leave your own stick as a sign that you were the criminal? Confess, Lestrade, that is very unlikely.
As to the stick, Mr. Holmes, you know as well as I do that a criminal is often flurried and does things the cool man would avoid. He was very likely afraid to go back to the room. Give me another theory that would fit the facts.
I could easily give you half a dozen, said Holmes. Here, for example, is a very possible and even probable one. I make you a free present of it. The older man is showing documents which are of evident value. A passing tramp sees them through the window, the blind of which is only half down. Exits the solicitor, enter the tramp. He seizes the stick, which he observes there, kills Old Acre, and departs after burning the body. Why should a tramp burn the body? For the matter of that, why should McFarlane? To hide some evidence? Possibly the tramp wanted to hide that any murder had been committed.
And why did the tramp take nothing?
Because there were papers that he could not negotiate.
Lestrade shook his head, though it seemed to me that his manner was less absolutely assured than before. Well, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you may look for your tramp, and while you are finding him, we will hold on to your man. The future will show which is right. Just notice this point, Mr. Holmes, that so far we have known none of the papers were removed, and that the prisoner is the one man in the world who had no reason of removing them, since he is the heir at law, and would come into them in any case. My friend seems struck by this remark.
I don't mean to deny that the evidence in some ways are very strongly in favor of your theory, said he. I only wish to point out that there are other theories possible. As you say, the future will decide. Good morning. I dare say that in the course of the day I shall drop by Norwood and see how you are getting on.
Then the detective departed. My friend rose and made his preparations for this day's work, with an alert air of a man who has a congenial task before him.
My first movement, Watson, he said, as he bustled into his frock coat, must, as I said, be in the direction of Blackheath.
And not Norwood?
Because we have in this case a singular incident coming close to the heels of another singular incident. The police are making the mistake of concentrating their attention on the second, because it happens to be the one which is actually criminal. But it is evident to me that the logical way to approach the case is to begin by trying to throw some light upon the first incident.
The curious will, so suddenly made, and due unexpectedly in air, it may do something to simplify what followed. Now, my dear fellow, I don't think you can help me. There is no prospect of danger, or I should not dream of stirring out without you. I trust that when I see you in the evening, I will be able to report that I have been able to do something for this unfortunate youngster who has thrown himself upon our protection. It was late in the evening when my friend returned, and I could see by a glance at his haggard, anxious face that the high hopes with which he had started out had not been fulfilled. For an hour he droned away upon his violin, endeavoring to soothe his own ruffled spirits. At last he flung down the instrument and plunged into a detailed account of his misadventure. It's all going wrong, Watson. All as wrong as it can go. I kept a bold face before Lestrade, but upon my soul I believe that for once the fellow is on the right track and we are on the wrong. All of my instincts are one way and all the facts are another, and I much fear that British juries have not yet attained the pitch of intelligence when they will give the preference to my theories over Lestrade's facts. Did you go to Blackheath? Yes, Watson. I went there and found very quickly that the late lamented Oldacre was a pretty considerable blackguard. The father was away in search of the son. The mother was at home. A little fluffy blue-eyed person with a tremor of fear and indignation. Of course, she would not admit even the possibility of his guilt, but she would not express either surprise or regret over the late fate of Oldacre. On the contrary, she spoke of him with such bitterness that she was unconsciously considerably strengthening the case for the police. For, of course, if her son had heard of her speak to this man in this fashion, it would predispose him towards hatred and violence.
He was more like a malignant and cunning ape than a human being, said she, and he always was ever since he was a young man.
You knew him at that time, said I.
Yes, I knew him well. In fact, he was an old suitor of mine. Thank heaven that I had the sense to turn away from him and marry a better, if a poorer man. I was engaged to him, Mr. Holmes, when I heard a shocking story of how he had turned a cat loose into an aviary, and I was so horrified at his brutality and cruelty that I should have nothing more to do with him.
She, rummaging into a bureau, presented a photograph of a woman shamefully defaced and mutilated by a knife.
That is my own photograph, said she. He sent it to me in that state, with his curse upon my wedding morning.
Yikes. Well, said I, at least he has forgiven you now, and has left you all his property to his son.
Neither my son nor I want anything from old Jonas Acre. Dead or alive, she cried, with the proper spirit. If there is a God in heaven, Mr. Holmes, and that same God who has punished the wicked man will show his own good time that my son's hands are guiltless of his blood.
Well, I tied 1 and 2 leads, but could get nothing which would help my hypothesis, and several points which would make against it. I gave up at last, and I went off to Norwood. This place, deep in a house, is a big modern villa of staring black, standing back from its own grounds, with a laurel-clumped lawn in front of it. To the right, and some distance back of the road, is a timber yard which has been the scene of the fire. Here's a rough plan on the leaf of my own notebook. This window on the left is the one which opens to Oldacre's room. You can look into it from the road, and you see. That is about the only bit of consolation I have had today. Lestrade has not been there, but his head constable did the honors. They had just made a great treasure trove. They had spent the morning raking among the ashes and burning wood pile, and besides the charred organic remains, they had secured several discolored metal discs. I examined them with care, and they were, no doubt, trouser buttons. I even distinguished that one from which marked the name of Hyams, who was Oldacre's tailor. Then I worked on the lawn carefully for signs and traces of draught were made, and everything from it hard as iron. Nothing was to be seen save for some body or bundle had been dragged through the low privet hedge which is in the line of the woodpile. All that, of course, fits in the official theory. I crawled out about the lawn with an August sun on my back. I got up at the end of an hour no wiser than before. Well, after this fiasco, I went into the bedroom and examined that also. The bloodstains were very slight, mere smears or discolorations, but undoubtedly fresh. The stick had been removed, but there was also marks on the slate. There was no doubt about the stick belonging to our client. He admits it. Footmarks of both men could be made out of the carpet, and none of any third party, which again is the trick of the other side. They were piling up their score all the time and were at a standstill. Only one little gleam of hope did I get, and yet it amounted to nothing. I examined the contents of the safe, most of which had been taken out and left on the table. The papers had been made up into sealed envelopes, one or two of which I had opened by the police. They were not, so far as I could judge, of any great value, nor did the bank book show that Mr. Oldacre was in such very affluent circumstances. But it seemed to me that all the papers were not there. There were allusions to some deeds, possibly more valuable, which I could not find. This, of course, if we could disprove, would turn Lestrade's argument against himself, for who would steal such a thing if he knew they would shortly inherit it? Finally, having drawn every other corner and picked up no scent, I tried my luck at the housekeeper. Mrs. Lexington is her name, a little, dark, silent person, with suspicious and sidelong eyes. She could tell something if she would, I convinced it, but she was as close as wax. Yet she had let Mrs. MacFarlane in at 9:30. She wished her hand had withered before she had done so. She had gone into bed at 10:30. Her room was at the other end of the house, so she could hear nothing of what passed. MacFarlane had left his hat, and, to the best of her belief, a stick in the hole. She had been awakened by the alarm of the fire. Her poor dear master was certainly been murdered. Had he any enemies? Well, every man had enemies, but Mr. Oldacre kept himself so much to himself, and only met people in the way of business. She had seen the buttons, and was sure that they belonged to the clothes which he had worn that night. The woodpile was very dry, for it had been several months since it had rained. It burned like tinder, and by the time she reached the spot nothing could be seen but flames. She had all the firemen smelled of burning flesh from inside it. She knew nothing of the papers, nor of Mr. Oldacre's private affairs. So, my dear Watson, there's my report of a failure. And yet... He clutched his thin hands in a paroxysm of conviction. I know it's all wrong. I feel it in my bones. There's something that has not come out, and that housekeeper knows it. There's a sort of sulky defiance in her eyes, which only goes to the guilty knowledge. However, there's no good talking about any more, Watson. But unless some unlucky chance comes our way, I fear that the Norwood disappearance case will not figure in the chronicle of our successes, which I foresee that the patient public will sooner or later have to endure.
Surely, said I, a man's appearance would go far with any jury.
That is a dangerous argument, my dear Watson. You remember what terrible murderer, Bert Stevens, who wanted us to get him off in 87? Was there ever a more mild-mannered, Sunday-school-looking man?
Oh, that is true.
Unless we succeed in establishing an alternative theory, this man is lost. You can hardly find a flaw in the case which can now be presented against him, and further investigation has served to strengthen it. By the way, there is one curious little point about those papers which may serve us as the starting point for an inquiry. On looking over a bank book, I found that the low state of the balance was principally due to large checks which had been made out during the last year to a Mr. Cornelius. I confess that I should be interested to know who this Mr. Cornelius may be, with whom a retired builder has such a large transactions. Is it possible that he has had a hand in an affair? Cornelius might be a broker, and he might have found no script correction of these large payments. Failing any other indication, my researches must now take the direction of an inquiry to the bank for the gentleman who has cashed these checks. But I fear, my dear fellow, that our case will end ingloriously by Lestrade hanging our client, which is certainly a triumph for Scotland Yard.
I do not know how far Sherlock Holmes took any sleep that night, but when I came down to breakfast I found him pale and harassed, his bright eyes the brighter for the dark shadows around them. The carpet round his chair was littered with cigarette ends and with early editions of the morning papers. An open telegram lay upon the table.
What do you think of this, Watson?
He asked, tossing it across. It was from Norwood, and ran as follows. Important. Fresh evidence to hand. McFarlane's guilt definitely established. Advise you to abandon case. Lestrade.
This sounds serious, said I. It is Lestrade's little cockadoodle of victory.
Holmes answered with a bitter smile.
And yet it may be premature to abandon the case. After all, the important fresh evidence is a two-legged thing. It may possibly cut into a very different direction to which Lestrade imagines. Take your breakfast, Watson, and we will go together to see what we can do. I feel as if I should need your company and your moral support today.
My friend had no breakfast himself, for it was one of his peculiarities that in his more intense moments he would prevent himself no food, and have known him to presume upon his iron strength until he has fainted from pure inanition.
At present I cannot spare energy and nerve force for digestion,
he would say, in answer to my medical remonstrances. I was not surprised, therefore, when this morning he left his untouched meal behind him as we started with me for Norwood. A crowd of morbid sightseers were still gathered around Deep Den House, which was just such a suburban villa as I had pictured. Within the gates Lestrade met us, his face flushed with victory and his manner grossly triumphant.
Well, Mr. Holmes, have you proved us to be wrong yet? Have you found your tramp? He cried. I have formed no conclusions whatsoever, my companion answered. But we formed ours yesterday, and now it proves to be correct, and you must acknowledge that we have been a little in front of you all this time, Mr. Holmes. You certainly have the air of something unusual having occurred, said Holmes. Lestrade laughed loudly. You don't like being beaten any more than the rest of us do, said he. A man can't expect always to have it in his own way, can he, Dr. Watson? Step this way, if you please, gentlemen, and I think can convince you just once and for all that it was John McFarlane who did all these crimes.
He led us through the passage and out into a dark hall beyond.
This is where young McFarlane must have come out to get his hat after the crime was done, he said. Now look at this. With dramatic suddenness, he struck a match by his light and exposed a stain of blood upon the whitewashed wall.
As he held the match near, I saw that it was more than a stain. It was a well-marked print of a thumb.
Look at that with your magnifying glass, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I am doing so. You're aware that no two thumbprints are alike?
I've heard something like that.
Oh, then, you'll please to compare this print of this wax impression of young McFarlane's right thumb, taken by my orders this morning.
As he held the waxen print close to the blood stain, it did not take the magnifying glass to see that the two were undoubtedly from the same thumb.
It was evident to me that our unfortunate client was lost.
That is final,
Said Lestrade. Yes, that is final, I voluntarily echoed. It is final, said Holmes. Something in his tone caught my ear, and I turned to look at him. An extraordinary change had come over his face. It was writhing with inward merriment. His two eyes were shining like stars. It seemed to me that he was making desperate efforts to restrain a convulsive attack of laughter. Dear me, he said at last.
Oh, who would have thought it? And how deceptive appearances may be, to be sure. Such a nice young man to look at. It's our lessons for us not to trust our own judgment, isn't it, Lestrade? Yes, some of us are a little too much inclined to be cocksure, Mr. Holmes, said Lestrade. The man's insolence was maddening, but we could not resent it. What a professional thing that this young man should press his right thumb against the wall in taking his hat from the peg. Such very natural action, too, if you come to think of it. Holmes was outwardly calm, but his whole body gave a wiggle of suppressed excitement as he spoke. By the way, Lestrade, who made this remarkable discovery? It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Lexington, who drew the Knights Constable's attention to it. Where might this Knight Constable? He remained on guard in the bedroom where the crime was committed, as to see that nothing was touched. But why didn't the police see this mark yesterday? Well, we had no particular reason to make a careful examination of the hole. Besides, it's not a very prominent place, as you see. No, of course not. I suppose there is no doubt that the mark was there yesterday. Lestrade looked at Holmes as he thought he was going mad out of his mind. I confess that I myself was surprised at both his hilarious manner and his rather wild observation. I don't know whether you think that McFarlane came out to go to the dead of the night in order to strengthen the evidence against him, said Lestrade. I leave it to any experts in the world whether that is the mark of his thumb. It is unquestionably the mark of his thumb. That's enough, said Lestrade. I am a practical man, Mr. Holmes, and when I have got my evidence I come to any conclusions. If you have anything to say, you will find me writing my report in the sitting room. Holmes had recovered his equanimity, though I still seemed to detect gleams of amusement in his expression. Dear me, this is a very sad development, Watson, is it not? He said, and yet there are singular points about it which hold out some hopes of our client. Indeed, Holmes, what is it? Only this, that I know that mark was not there when I examined the hole yesterday. And now, Watson, let us have a little stroll around in the sunshine. With a confused brain, but with a heart into some warmth of hope was returning, I accompanied my friend into a walk around the garden. Holmes took each face of the house in turn and examined it with great interest. Then he led the way inside and went over the whole building from basement to the attics. Most of the rooms were unfurnished, but none the less Holmes suspected them minutely. Finally, on the top corridor, which ran outside, and untenanted bedrooms. Again he was seized with a spasm of merriment. There really are some very unique features about this case, Watson, he said. I think it is time that we took our friend Lestrade into our confidence. He has had his little smile at our expense, and perhaps we may do as much by him as if my reading of this problem proves to be correct. Yes. I think I see how we should approach it. The Scotland Yard inspector was still writing in the parlor when Holmes interrupted him. "I understood that you were writing a report on this case," said he. "So I am."
"Don't you think it may be a little premature? I can't help thinking that your evidence is not complete."
Lestrade knew my friend too well to disregard his words. He laid down his pen and looked curiously at him. "What do you mean, Mr. Holmes?"
"Only that there is an important witness whom you have not yet seen."
"Can you produce him?"
"I think I can."
Do so."
"I will do my best. How many constables have you?"
3 within call."
"Excellent," said Holmes. "May I ask if they are very large, able-bodied men with powerful voices?"
"I have no doubt that they are, though I fail to see what their voices have to do with anything."
"Perhaps I can help you to see and one or two things as well," said Holmes. "Kindly summon your men. I will try."
5 minutes later, 3 policemen had assembled in the hall.
"In the outhouse you will find a considerable quantity of straw," said Holmes. "I will ask you to carry it in 2 bundles of it. I think it will be of the greatest assistance in producing the witness from whom I require." "Thank you very much. I believe you have some matches in your pocket, Watson. Now, Mr. Lestrade, I will ask you all to accompany me to the top landing."
As I have said, there was a broad corridor there, which ran outside 3 empty bedrooms. At one end of the corridor were all marshalled by Sherlock Holmes, the constables grinning, and Lestrade staring at my friend in amazement, expectation, and derision chasing each other after across his features. Holmes stood before us with the air of a conjurer who is performing a trick.
"Would you kindly send one of your constables for 2 buckets of water, and put the straw on the floor here, free from wall on either side. Now I think we are all ready."
Lestrade's face had begun to grow red and angry.
"I don't know whether you think you're playing a game with us, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he. "If you know anything, you can surely say it without all the tomfoolery." "I assure you, my good Lestrade, that I have an excellent reason for everything I do. You may possibly remember that you have chaffed me a little some hours ago, and when the sun seemed on your side of the hedge, so you must not grudge me a little pomp and ceremony now. Might I ask you, Watson, to open that window, and then to put a match on the edge of the straw?"
I did so, and driven by the draught, the coil of grey smoke swirled down the corridor, while the dry straw crackled and flamed.
"Now we must see if we can find this witness for you, Lestrade. Might I ask you to join in the cry of fire? Now then, 1, 2, 3, fire! Fire! Fire!" We all yelled. "Thank you. I will trouble you once again. Fire!" "Just once more, gentlemen, and all together. Fire!"
The shout must have rung all over Norwood. It had hardly died away when an awakening thing happened. A door suddenly flew open out of what appeared to be a solid wall at the end of the corridor, and a little wizened man darted out like a rabbit out of its burrow.
"Capital," said Holmes calmly. "Watson, the bucket of water with straw. That will do. Lestrade, allow me to present you with our principal missing witness, Mr. Jonas Oldacre."
The detective stared at the newcomer with blank amazement. The latter was blinking in the light of the corridor and peering at us at the end of a smoldering fire.
It was an odious face, crafty, vicious, malignant, with shifty light grey eyes and white eyelashes. "What's this, then?" said Lestrade at last. "What have you been doing all this time, eh?" Oldacre gave an uneasy laugh, shrinking back from his furious red face of the angry detective. "I've done you no harm." "No harm? You've done your best to get an innocent man hanged. If it wasn't for this gentleman here, I'm sure that you could have not have succeeded." The wretched creature began to whimper. "I'm sure, sir, it was only my practical joke." "Oh, a joke, was it? You won't find the laugh on your side, I promise you. Take him down and keep him in the sitting room until I come. Mr. Holmes," he continued, when they had gone, "I would not speak before the constables, but I don't mind saying, in the presence of Dr. Watson, that this is the brightest thing that you have done yet, though it is a mystery to me how you did it. You have saved an innocent man's life, and you have prevented a very grave scandal, which would have ruined my reputation in the force." Holmes smiled and clapped Lestrade upon the shoulder. "Instead of being ruined, my good sir, you will find that your reputation has been enormously enhanced. Just make a few alterations to that report which you were writing, and they will understand how hard it is to throw dust out of the eyes of Inspector Lestrade." "And you don't want your name on it?" "Not at all. I work for my own record. Perhaps I shall get the credits also some distant day when I permit this zealous historian to lay out his fool's cap once more. Eh, Watson? Well, now, let us see where this rat has been lurking." A lath and plaster partition had been run across the 6 feet of the end, with a door cunningly concealed within it. It was lit within slits of the eaves. A few articles of furniture and a supply of food and water were within, together with a number of books and papers. "There's an advantage of being a builder," said Holmes as we came out. "He was able to fix up his own little hiding-place without any confederate, save, of course, that precious housekeeper of his, whom I should lose no time in adding to your bad, Lestrade." "I'll take your advice, but how did you know this place, Mr. Holmes?" "I made up my mind that the fellow was hiding in the house, when I paced out the corridor and found it was 6 feet shorter than the other corresponding one below. It was pretty clear where he was. I never thought he would be quite the nerve to lie quiet before an alarm of fire. We could, of course, however, gone in and taken him out, but it amused me to make him reveal himself. Besides, I owed you a little mystification, Lestrade, from your chaff in the morning." "Oh, sir, you certainly got equal with me on that. But how in the world did you know that he was in the house at all?" "The thumb mark, Lestrade. You said it was final, and so it was in a very different sense. I knew it had not been there the day before. I pay good attention to detail in the matters, as you have often observed, and I had examined the hall and was sure that the wall was clear. Therefore it had been put on during the night." "But how?" "Very simply. When those packets were sealed up, Mr. Jonas Oldacre got McFarlane to secure one of the seals by putting his thumb upon the soft wax. It would have done so quickly and naturally, do I say, that the young man himself has no recollection of it. Very likely it was just so happened, and Oldacre found himself in no position of use, he would put to it. Brooding over the case at the den of his, he suddenly struck him that he would absolutely damning evidence if he could make against McFarlane by using that thumb mark. It was the simplest thing in the world for him to make a wax impression from the seal, to moisten it as much blood as he could get from a pinprick, and to put a mark upon the wall during the night, either with his own hand or with that of his housekeeper. If you examine among those documents, which he took with him into his retreat, I will lay you a wager that you find the seal with a thumb mark upon it."
Wonderful, said Lestrade. Wonderful. It is clear as crystal, as you put it. But what is the object of his deep deception, Mr. Holmes? It was amusing to me to see how the detective's overbearing manner had changed suddenly to that of a child asking questions of his teacher. Well, I don't think it's very hard to explain. A very deep, malicious, vindictive person is a gentleman who is now waiting downstairs. You know that he was once refused by McFarlane's mother. You don't. I told you that you should go to Blackheath first and Norwood afterwards. Well, this inquiry, as he would consider it, was rankled in his wicked, scheming brain all his life, as he was longed for vengeance and never seen his chance. During the last year or two, things had gone against him. Secret speculation, I think, and he finds himself in a bad way. He determines to swindle his creditors, and for the purpose he pays large checks to a certain Mr. Cornelius, who is, I imagine, himself under a different name. I have not traced these checks yet, but I have no doubts that they were banked under the name of some provincial town where Oldacre, from time to time, led a double existence. He intended to change his name altogether, draw the money, and vanish, starting his life elsewhere. That's likely enough. It would strike him that, in disappearing, he might throw all pursuit off his track, and at the same time have an ample and crushing revenge upon his old sweetheart. If he could give the impression that he had been murdered by her only child. It was a masterly piece of villainy, and he carried it out like a master. The idea of the will, which would give an obvious motive for the crime, the secret visit unknown by his parents, the retention of the stick, the blood, and the animal remains and buttons for the woodpile were all very admirable. It was a net from which it seemed to me a few hours ago that there was no possible escape. But he had not the supreme gift of an artist, and knowledge of when to stop. He wished to improve that which was already perfect, to draw the rope tighter yet around the neck of the unfortunate victim, and so he ruined it all. Let us descend, Lestrade. There are just one or two questions that I would ask him. The malignant creature was seated in his own parlour with a policeman upon each side of him. It was a joke, my good sir, a practical joke, nothing more. He whined incessantly. I assure you, sir, that I simply concealed myself in order to effect my disappearance, and I am sure that you would have not been so unjust as to imagine that I would have allowed any harm to befall the young McFarlane. That's for a jury to decide, said Lestrade. Anyhow, we shall now have you on charge of conspiracy, if not for attempted murder. And you'll probably find that your creditor will impound the banking account of Mr. Cornelius, said Holmes. The little man stared and turned his malignant eyes upon my friend. I have to thank you a good deal, he said. Perhaps I'll pay my debt some day. Holmes smiled indignantly. I fancy that for some years you will find your time very fully occupied, said he. By the way, was it you who put the woodpile beside your old trousers? A dead dog, rabbits, or what? You won't tell. Dear me, how very unkind of you. Well, I dare say that a couple of rabbits could account for both the blood and for the charred ashes. If you ever write an account, Watson, you can make rabbits serve your turn. Okay. Ouch. Yay. 2 stories down. Ouch. Oh, I still have my Christmas decorations up. Guess I should take those down eventually. No, my chat window vanished. That's funny. But anyway, again, thank you all for coming by. That's 2 down. I think 14 more to go, maybe less. I tried to keep the books down to 15 or 16 stories, which kind of like the book above me. Oh well. Let's see who was handy to raid. Let's see. Oni is on. Dusk is on. Falcor's on. Falcor's another reader, but you know, she's reading ASMR and she's reading Peter Pan. Cool. I haven't read Peter Pan for a long time. Maybe I should add that to my list. I mean, I've got it, so. Or if anyone has any suggestions, by all means, toss them out there. No points needed. Anyone else I know on right now? Feel free to wave if anyone's lurking, please. Anyone? My stream's reading again. I hope it didn't die anytime during this. No, the timer's still going, so I guess it didn't die. So, who did I raid last time? Did I raid Dusk or did I raid Oni? Ouch. Let me go ahead and raid Oni. So, again, thank everyone for coming by. I do have a follower raid set and a sub raid set. So pick whichever one you want to do, or if you can do, I should be able to unlock the book one anyway if you want. So, and I will see you all in Oni's as soon as I type raid. Raid, not road. And have a good night, good afternoon, good morning, whichever may apply. And I will hopefully see you all tomorrow for fairy tales. Have a good one.